Great. I see that a lot of us have joined, and I see the welcome messages from different parts of here in Canada. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us from the West Coast. My name is Hamara Osman, and on behalf of Muscular Dystrophy Canada, I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinar from our new Let's Talk NMD, Let's Talk Neuromuscular Disorders series. Before I introduce today's topic, I would like to mention that we have muted all participants, but I welcome you to type any questions or comments throughout today's session in the chat box. We have allotted time at the end of today's webinar for a live Q&A. Please note a recording of today's webinar will be made available by the end of the day on our MDC YouTube channel. With that said, let's get started. Today's weekly webinar is on nutrition, supplements, and healthy eating for individuals impacted by neuromuscular disorders in the era of COVID-19. As an organization that represents over 160 different neuromuscular disorders, we recognize that nutrition is an important aspect of the long-term management for motor neuron diseases, neuropathies, disorders of the neuromuscular junction, myopathies, and metabolic diseases. There is research that shows overnutrition can have harmful effects on glucose metabolism, mobility, respiratory, and cardiologic functions, and can actually increase risk of fractures for individuals with NMDs. There can also be a negative impact of hyponutrition on muscle and ventilatory function, constipation, and other gastrointestinal complications. Chewing and swallowing difficulties may pose an increased risk of aspiration, which can predispose people to infectious diseases and complications, as well as osteoporosis. Sometimes our positive medical achievements for NMDs can also result in negative consequences from a nutritional standpoint. For example, the use of chronic steroid therapy has made important strides in the lung function of boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, yet the improved length and quality of life is threatened by an increased prevalence of obesity. Such treatments, restrictions in activities through loss of ambulation or pain, and reduced energy can all contribute to obesity. Obesity results in increased respiratory load for individuals with neuromuscular disorders who already are at risk of impaired respiratory and cardiac function. Obesity also strongly influences sleep-disordered breathing. We also know that for individuals with metabolic muscle conditions such as Pompe disease, changes in diet and maintaining optimal weight can actually help to slow down the progressive damage to muscles. So with all this in mind, it's understandable that COVID-19 poses a concern on our overall well-being, as physical distancing and social isolation has contributed to a loss of a daily routine, has disrupted healthy eating and exercise behaviors. We are very grateful for a terrific lineup of speakers that can help to address the questions you have about nutrition, supplements, and maintaining a healthy weight and lifestyle for individuals with NMDs. In advance of their presentations, I would like to thank each of them for their time and expertise. First, we have Dr. Mark TARNOPOLSKY. Dr. TARNOPOLSKY completed an MD and PhD in cell biology and metabolism at McMaster University, and he completed his residency training in internal medicine, physical medicine, and neurology at McMaster and the University of Rochester in New York. He is currently the clinical and research director of Corkins-Lambert Family Neuromuscular and Neurometabolic Clinic, and holds an endowed chair at McMaster Children's Hospital and Hamilton Health Sciences Foundation in neuromuscular diseases. He is a professor of pediatrics and medicine. He has published over 460 papers in peer-reviewed literature related to neuromuscular, neurometabolic, and neurogenic disorders, aging and exercise, and nutrition. Welcome, Dr. TARNOPOLSKY. I'll go ahead and stop sharing so you can share your slides now.
Thanks very much, and it's good to have everyone here. Can people hear me? Hello?
Yes, your volume is great. Go ahead, and you can go ahead and share your slides as well now.
Okay, so unfortunately, because of COVID-19, it's taking me twice as long to see patients. And as a consequence, I was booked for about 12 hours talking to people and seeing consults. And I didn't realize till about 10 minutes ago that I had to have a presentation. But I know what I want to talk about, and I pulled up a presentation from before to go through some of the key points. So the first point that I think that's important to make is that when people have neuromuscular disorders and they're not moving as much, we tend not to burn as much energy. If you're not burning as much energy, you don't have to take in as many calories. Otherwise, if you take in too many calories, there's an energy imbalance. With an energy imbalance, of course, that can lead to weight gain and eventually obesity. We've noticed over the years, and we're in the process of working on a paper where obesity is underdiagnosed and underrecognized amongst neuromuscular disease patients. And probably the reason for that is that when people lose a lot of muscle, you really don't see the expansion of the fat, because to some extent it's as though the muscle shrinks and it's being replaced by fat. Well, it's more that the muscle shrinks and then the fat just fills up the space there if we gain too much weight. So although some patients can appear almost quote unquote cachectic and as though they have too little body fat, sometimes when we do a fancy thing called a DEXA scanner, which tells us the percent body fat, we're finding that many of our patients, although they look very thin, actually have what's called a body mass index, which indicates that they're overweight and actually in some cases obese. And so that's really one of the big issues, is that if patients continue to eat what the Canadian guidelines tell you, for someone who's able-bodied, you tend to put on weight. So in order to maintain your weight and not become obese, a lot of patients tend not to eat as much. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Good. My screen is no longer being shared because I've got some slides there.
Yeah, it wasn't shared from the beginning. So go ahead and we'll stop sharing and we'll wait for your screen to be shared.
Yeah, that's weird that it wasn't. Let me just see if I could try it this way. Can people see it now?
Looks great. Thank you.
Oh, good. So just to set this up, because a lot of patients tend to eat less so that they don't gain too much weight, we wanted to see if people were meeting the nutritional needs of the Canadian population guidelines. So this was a study we published some time ago in Muscle and Nerve, and we had 51 patients who had muscular dystrophy. Most had myotonic dystrophy, limb girdle, mostly the type 2A and 2B, and FSH dystrophy. And we also had 14 boys with Duchenne dystrophy. So we did diet record analysis where we did a complete diet analysis on 2 occasions separated by 5 months so that we could look at the reproducibility and get the average. We included 2 weekdays and a weekend day. And what we did is we looked at the mean values that they were taking and compared it to, at that time, the Canadian dietary recommended intake levels. So what we found, and what we have here in white are the adult levels and in green are pediatric. And as I mentioned before, the energy intake is low. So only 68% of patients were meeting the current energy intake requirements. And this really makes sense because if you have muscle weakness and you're not as active, of course, you're not going to be burning as much energy. So you have to reduce your energy intake so that you don't get an energy imbalance. The problem, though, is when people aren't eating as much, you tend to take in fewer vitamins and minerals. So what we see here are the proportion of people who are not meeting the vitamin A requirements, the vitamin C requirements, the vitamin D requirements, and so on and so forth as we go through. The point here is important things like vitamin B12, for example. 23% of the patients were not meeting the current guidelines. And why that's important is that vitamin B12 deficiency can also lead to a neuropathy. And it's in fact the 3rd most common cause of acquired neuropathy in North America. So a very treatable neuropathy superimposed on someone that has, for example, a genetic neuropathy like Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, or in a muscle disease like muscular dystrophy, is certainly something that you don't want to miss. The other thing that's very apparent, and I'll talk more about this, is vitamin D. So when we did this study at that time, the guidelines were really to prevent rickets. We now know that for optimal muscle health, vitamin D insufficiency can even affect muscle. We've in fact had a couple of people referred to me with severe vitamin D deficiency. Well, they didn't know it at the time. They thought they had a metabolic myopathy. And all we found was a profoundly low vitamin D. Their muscle enzymes were up and they were weak. And when we treated them, that went back to normal. So again, missing a vitamin D deficiency in someone with a genetic myopathy or neuropathy is something you don't want to miss. in the same way you don't want to miss a vitamin B12 deficiency. So if we look here, this is just getting a little bit at the body mass index issue. So body mass index is an indicator of, it's a very crude indicator of obesity. So if it's over 30, that means that someone is overweight. So most people, if you look at folks with myotonic muscular dystrophy type 1, people tend to think of them as being cachectic. And yet 10% of our patients had a body mass index indicating that they were overweight and 13% that they were underweight. So I think it's very important here, this highlights that you can have a huge spectrum even within a given disease population. So some of our myotonic dystrophy patients are overweight, some are underweight. And the nutritional recommendations for those individuals can be very different. The other thing that we'd like to emphasize is to really know what's going on. Body mass index is good for populations, but it's not great for individuals. So certainly if you're seeing a nutritionist or a dietitian or coming to a clinic like ours that has a very fancy thing called a DEXA scanner, we can see exactly how much body fat, how much muscle mass people have, and get a better sense for what the nutritional needs are of that individual. As we move down here, I've mentioned the energy insufficiency that most people have just to match the decrease in energy output, which then pulls down, for lack of a better term, the ability to get all of your other nutrients in. But one I'd like to highlight here is protein. And I think protein is very important. I actually did a part of my PhD looking at protein metabolism. And the protein requirements in the Canadian Dietary Reference Intake are generally just under 1 gram per kilogram per day. And what happens is with the increased turnover of muscle, the protein requirements should be around 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram per day. So probably in the order of 40 to 50% higher per kilogram than the general population. The problem with that, of course, if you're having a lower energy intake, it's hard to get protein in. And all proteins are not created equal. So when people think about protein, there's different quality. And the highest quality are milk and eggs. Those have very good, what we call biological value. So I think it's important when people are thinking about protein to make sure that the quality is high. Next in line are things like fish and meat. But of course, we have to be careful with certain meats to make sure that we trim away the fat and we have very lean types of meat. It is very difficult for a person with muscular dystrophy to be able to get enough protein if you're a vegan vegetarian. Certainly a lacto-ovo vegetarian, because of the eggs and milk, you could get enough protein. But a vegan, it would be very difficult, and you'd have to do that under very careful dietary advice from a nutritionist or a dietitian. And that's something I think that as we go through, we'll emphasize making sure that protein intake is adequate. So I'll move to the next slide. So what we wanted to do is, knowing that people didn't seem to be taking in as much energy as we thought, and consequently they weren't taking in all of the nutrients that were being recommended, well, what does that really mean? Do people actually have deficiencies? And this is an old slide. Again, I didn't have time to update it because we've been continually doing this. We now have about 3,000 blood measures that we have in patients with neuromuscular disease. And the important ones that I'm going to just draw your attention to, as I've highlighted before, is vitamin B12 and vitamin D in particular. So I'll just go to this one here. So you can see vitamin B12. These are the proportion of patients that had either mitochondrial disease or a neuropathy. And you can see that mitochondrial disease, which is a genetic disorder, was as high as people who came in with an acquired neuropathy, knowing that vitamin B12 is one of the most common causes of acquired neuropathy. And you can see here that in our mitochondrial patients, 16% had vitamin B12 deficiency. And that's dramatic if you think about it, because in general, we can't cure genetic disorders like a mitochondrial myopathy or muscular dystrophy. And I think a lot of neurologists and geneticists have a sort of therapeutic nihilism about treating folks. But my goodness, if you missed a vitamin B12 deficiency, it can cause dementia, neuropathy, spinal cord problems, and huge issues in the neurologic system. So you wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to treat something that is preventable or partially reversible. What we found, and again, I don't have my up-to-date slides, is that in muscular dystrophy, about 13% of our patients had vitamin B12 deficiency. The other important thing I'd like to point out as well is that generally we would like vitamin B12 levels to be over 180 picomoles per liter, whereas most cutoffs are 120. But we know that even at 160, for example, the tissue can be deficient. Now you see here the vitamin D, and this is, if you learn nothing from me, this is the important thing. Back in the old days, the levels for vitamin D deficiency were to prevent rickets, which was 75 or 80 nanomoles per liter, depending on the guidelines. We now know that those levels, sorry, my mistake, those are the current levels. The old levels were 30 nanomoles per liter. So at 30 nanomoles per liter, we still had about 10% of our patients being deficient. Now the Canadian government recommends 75 to 80 nanomoles per liter. And as a consequence, 85% of our patients with neuromuscular disorders are insufficient in vitamin D. What we do find is with the old guidelines here, around 12 to 13% are so deficient that they can actually get a myopathy just from severe vitamin D deficiency. So generally what we recommend is that if your hospital allows you to measure it and replace appropriately. There are certain restrictions in Ontario, at least, that a family doctor can't just order a vitamin D level. And if that's the case, I would just take 2,000 units of vitamin D. That keeps about 85% of the population into the current recommended guidelines, and about 98% of the population would be sufficient. So you wouldn't be in the severe deficiency state. So those are a couple of recommendations to start with. There's a whole bunch of specifics. We can talk about creatine. Just briefly, I'll just go through. Again, I apologize, I didn't have this whole thing ready. Where's my creatine? Yeah, so I'll just talk about creatine because that's the only supplement that has gone through what's called a Cochrane review. A Cochrane review essentially takes all of the studies that have been done in humans, clinical trials, put them together, and it determines whether it's something that is worth taking. And at the end of the day, the Cochrane review does conclude that creatine is a benefit for muscular dystrophy. So creatine is actually made in our body from our liver and our kidneys. Most of the creatine is stored in muscle, but it's also in very high concentration in nerve. But we also get it in our food. So if we eat meat or fish, we get about 1 gram per day. If you're a vegan vegetarian, you're going to be creatine deficient just to begin with because you don't get anything from plant sources. And the amount that's synthesized endogenously is not sufficient. So every vegan vegetarian is going to be deficient in creatine. What we found back in 1999 is that the muscle levels of creatine in patients with muscular dystrophy, inflammatory myopathy, and in congenital myopathies were very low. And if you think about one of the markers of muscular dystrophy, which is the creatine kinase or CK level, which everyone's probably familiar with, that's due to the damage of the muscle membrane releasing this enzyme from the muscle. So if the enzyme that's involved in making phosphocreatine is leaking out, it's no surprise that creatine levels were quite low. So we reasoned that replacing creatine at 3 times the normal dietary intake would be helpful. And creatine has a whole bunch of roles in energy metabolism. It can also slow down muscle protein breakdown and increase synthesis. And we did a number of studies based on some early work in athletes where they found that loading, even with low doses like 3 grams a day, which is 3 times your normal dietary intake, would fully load skeletal muscle. So I won't go through all the specifics, but essentially, yes, in our muscular dystrophy patients, mitochondrial disease and inflammatory myopathy, we found very low levels. So we wanted to treat patients, and I won't go through this. This just shows that other neurologic disease benefit, but the highlight is muscular dystrophy. So we know that creatine in healthy people can increase fat-free mass. It increases strength and power. It is a partial antioxidant, and we know certainly with Duchenne, which is depicted here, that there is an increase in oxidative stress and a reduction in mitochondrial function, and creatine can sometimes help that. In a muscular dystrophy mouse model, there's also too much calcium in the muscle, which causes damage, and that was lowered with creatine. So there have been a number of studies. This was one published by a German group where they gave creatine to patients with muscular dystrophy, 10 grams a day for adults and 5 grams in pediatric, and they improved their muscle score and their neuromuscular symptoms improved. This was another study from a Belgian group. I won't go through it, but this was Becker and Duchenne showing improvements. We did a study that was published in the Journal of Neurology, funded by the Muscular Dystrophy Association in the US, and we did a randomized trial in boys with Duchenne. Dr. Doug Bigger, who's one of my colleagues in Toronto, who ran the pediatric clinic at Holland Bloor View, was a colleague who contributed to this. And we gave the boys 5 grams of creatine per day and did a whole bunch of measurements. And what we found is the mega score. So that means we add up the MRC grade of their strength over 4 months. It deteriorated less when they were on creatine versus the normal deterioration in Duchenne dystrophy. Their hand grip, especially in their exercising hand, their right hand or their left, whichever was dominant, tended to go up, and that was stat significant. And they increased muscle mass. There was also a reduction in a marker of bone breakdown, and we've done all sorts of studies now in mice and humans showing that creatine actually protects bone, which is important when we have something like Duchenne and other muscular dystrophies treated with prednisone. So the bottom line with all of this, and there's a whole bunch of other studies, which I won't get into, is that at the end of the day, the Cochrane review showed that on average there's about an 8.5% increase in strength and about a 0.63 kilogram increase in muscle mass in the Cochrane review. And that's since been updated more recently. So I'll leave it there because I know there's a million questions and others have to talk about different things. But those are a few of the things that we've done relevant to supplements and nutrition.
Excellent, thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and share the slides now so that we can have Lolly. Lolly, do you want to go ahead and also test your mic at this time point too? All right, so while Lolly is just testing her mic, we have Lori Chen from Holland Bloor View Kids Rehabilitation Hospital here in Toronto. Lori completed her dietetic education from Western University and has been in clinical practice for more than 30 years in a pediatric rehabilitation hospital serving children with disabilities. In addition to her clinical practice, her research interest includes exploring energy requirements, obesity, and the evaluation parameters in children with disabilities. She has been a collaborator in several published research articles in peer-reviewed journals about obesity in children with disability. Welcome, Lori. And I'm wondering if Lori is having mic issues, Lori. Looks like she is. I apologize today for our technical difficulties. What we'll do is while I provide instructions to Lori, we'll go ahead and move on to Leslie Krongold. So I'll just move on to her slides and then we'll get Leslie's talk. So Dr. Leslie Krongold has a Doctor of Education. Leslie was diagnosed with myotonic dystrophy in 1998 and she joined an MDA support group. Within a couple of months being the group's facilitator, she took over. Since then, Krongold has facilitated support groups for adults with neuromuscular disease for over 20 years, has launched and trained support group facilitators for the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, and 2016 took her work to the next level with the podcast Glass Half Full. Dr. Krongold also recently served on MDA's National Community Advisory Committee for 2 years. Dr. Krongold.
Hi. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. So as someone with a neuromuscular condition that currently has no treatment, and I have DM1, I make every effort to fortify myself for all seasons, and especially now during a virus pandemic. I like to say I practice radical self-care, and much of what I do can also be considered immune enhancement. These behaviors include a number of daily routines related to my nutrition, exercise, relaxation, and attitude or emotions. I will focus on nutrition for the purpose of this webinar, but diet alone is not sufficient. The bedrock of my self-care is a good night's sleep. Everything I do during my waking hours is meant to enhance my night's sleep and relaxation so my body can restore and rejuvenate, so my next day is productive and filled with quality, and my diet assists me with achieving those goals. So I have 10 strategies that I use to maintain a healthy immune system, and the first one is food equals medicine. Eating well is a dynamic endeavor for me. I grew up eating a very traditional meat, potatoes, and salad diet. It was not until college that I began to experiment with food. What my mother fed me was not bad. We were limited by choices at the supermarket, and in the 60s and 70s, iceberg lettuce was king. I thought feeling bloated after a meal was normal, but when I got to college, I gradually ate less meat, and my stomach issues improved. Dietary changes were not traumatic. It took years before I became a full vegetarian. But for the last 20 plus years, I've been primarily plant-based, or what some call a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, which you already heard. I eat eggs and limited dairy. And I've grown to view food as medicine, and I invite you to do the same. The more you learn about different foods and what they do for your body, the more you see how they can be medicine. Strategy number 2, nutrient density. When I was growing up, I learned about the food pyramid, which recommended how many servings of various foods you need. These pyramids were sponsored by different entities that had an investment in telling you what to eat, such as the Dairy Council or beef industry. I mean, food pyramids are still around, but there's been a shift in focus to plate portion sizes and the nutritional density of food. Nutrient density identifies the amount of beneficial nutrients in a particular food in proportion to its energy content or calories. You can find lists of the most nutrient-dense foods. Some are kale, berries, sweet potatoes, seaweed, garlic, avocado, almonds, walnuts, broccoli, cauliflower, oats, quinoa, lentils, kidney beans, to name just a few, and some also on the list. This pyramid on the screen is one that I do appreciate. It's from Dr. Andrew Weil, who has training in both Western and Eastern medicine, and it most represents how I eat. The 6th level down from the top is all about mushrooms, which I love. They're one of the staples in my diet. And so for optimal digestion, you want to cook the mushrooms. No raw mushrooms for me. And many mushrooms are known for boosting the immunity. Strategy number 3, experiment with new foods. Perhaps our inclination during this trying time is to fall back on comfort foods. But are those comfort foods rich with nutrients? Right now, a lot of common foods like white flour are difficult to find, at least here in the States, and I'm in California. Other flours are more bountiful, like buckwheat or oat flour. Even more reason to expand your horizons. Another way to experiment is to look at foods you may be familiar with, such as oatmeal, and see it anew. Rather than eating oatmeal with fruit, sugar, and milk, treat it as a savory dish. I like to add sauteed onions, red peppers, mushrooms, and tahini in my oatmeal. Being hunkered down at home now, you can view the kitchen as a place for creativity. Make cooking fun by experimenting. Sure, you may have a few duds, but whoever thought bananas and peanut butter would be so delicious? Someone took a chance with that. Don't stop the creativity with food, though. Try new things with beverages. And I really mean water, since that is the healthiest beverage we have. At my house, we're taking glass jars you'd use for canning and making a daily sun tea. Just add some immunity-enhancing herbs to water and put it on your back porch or a window for a few hours. You can jazz up sparkling water too with some fresh squeezed lemon or lime juice. Strategy number 4, experiment with healthy cooking methods. I admit I do very little cooking in my house. I used to love to cook, but now my manual dexterity can't handle many of the kitchen tools. Don't ask me to stir anything in a pot, but my partner does a lot of prep cook for me, my staples, and I can arrange them as I want during the week. Taking some cooked greens and mushrooms for my oatmeal, for example. Other staples include roasted radishes, carrots, peppers, a little olive oil, and baking or roasting of these vegetables is amazing, and it's healthier than frying. In my myotonic patient community, half of us experience dysphagia or swallowing difficulty. I'm not sure how common this is with other neuromuscular diseases. It does add another challenge to eating. So in terms of kitchen tools, a Cuisinart and immersion blender are priceless. I don't really operate these, but I am part of the cooking process, suggesting spices and combinations and doing a taste test here and there. If dysphagia is something you're dealing with, please check out a recent webinar my spouse and I did for the Myotonic Foundation. We even did a cooking demonstration video. Excuse me. In fact, I was so sold on the idea of getting people in the community to experiment in the kitchen during this pandemic that we started a cooking video contest. And hopefully we'll all discover some new delicious and nutritious meals. Strategy number 5, eat a variety of foods. It's very easy to fall into a rut with food, especially if you're not interested in going outside of your comfort zone. Perhaps one way to challenge you to eat a more varied, healthy diet is to consider the rainbow. Each day, keep a food journal and record what you've eaten and see how close you come to eating a rainbow. Colorful foods are generally fruits and vegetables. If you eat the rainbow, you almost always guarantee you'll be getting the vitamins and minerals that you need. But that doesn't include food dyes, so don't go making your rice or French fries purple. Strategy number 6, eat smaller, more frequent meals. In my patient community, a lot of us experience gastrointestinal issues. I did for much of my life. Becoming a vegetarian helped, and then eating more home-cooked meals helped, because you never know how food is prepared in a restaurant. Restaurants are a business, and their bottom line is not health, but making a profit. This change in lifestyle may not work for everyone, but you could give it a try to see if you feel any better. More energy and fewer GI problems are definitely worth any of the inconvenience for me. I made this change after a doctor at one of my support group meetings suggested each meal should be the portion size I could hold in my hands. Strategy number 7, try fermented foods. Fermented foods have been around for ages. Some cultures have them as a regular part of their diet, like kimchi as part of Korean cuisine, or miso as part of Japanese cuisine. It's an ancient method of preserving foods by breaking down carbs like starch and sugar by bacteria and yeast. This process preserves the food's shelf life, but also adds nutritional value and serves as a dose of probiotics. I wasn't always a big fan of fermented foods, though I do love tempeh, which is from soybeans and less processed than tofu. But my partner turned me on to Sandor Katz. Katz is something of a fermentation guru and literally wrote the Bible of fermentation. Katz contracted AIDS in the 1980s and credits his diet, rich in fermented foods, as a big part of his healing and longevity. I had the opportunity to interview him for my podcast, and you could check that out on the Food is Medicine webpage that I have. So you don't want to fill your diet with fermented foods. Just consider them as a healthy condiment. I like adding sauerkraut to my oatmeal or scrambled eggs. Strategy number 8, don't forget exercise and movement. When this whole quarantine began in early March, one of my biggest regrets was not being able to go to my exercise classes. Not only does this group exercise feel good, but it's a big part of my social network. Well, I'm thrilled to say that I'm exercising more now than I did before. Thank you, Zoom. There are all kinds of classes available via Zoom, and I've listed a few websites that offer free, accessible classes online. And many of these accessible classes I take are taught by people in wheelchairs. Most of them are fairly gentle, and everyone does what they can. It's amazing to see all of the diverse bodies and diverse type of movement. And movement is important to me. It assists with my digestion, it helps me maintain a good appetite, and it helps me learn about my changing body. I've been practicing yoga for many years, and I believe it's through this practice that I've been able to learn more about what my body needs in terms of food. It's not screaming for ice cream or potato chips. Sometimes it wants a bitter taste. Sometimes it needs more protein. So exercise and movement for me are very connected to maintaining a healthy diet. Strategy number 9, don't forget relaxation and sleep. In my introduction, I told you how everything I do during the day is meant to help me sleep that night. That includes a few gentle yoga postures, a few minutes of calm or deep breathing to quiet myself once or twice each day. And for many, that may be a short nap or just being horizontal for 10 minutes during the day. It also involves my eating and drinking habits. I try to have my larger meals earlier in the day, and my 4th and 5th meals are smaller and lighter. I stop eating and drinking at least 3 hours before bedtime, and right before I get into bed, I take a warm bath. Strategy number 10, don't forget attitude and emotions. I listened to the previous webinar about stress and anxiety and appreciate what Dr. Kamkar had to say about the importance of a healthy diet maintaining mental health. It's hard to say what came first for me. Did my diet improve due to better emotional regulation? Or did changes in my diet improve my ability to emotionally regulate and cultivate resilience? It's hard to say which one behavior is the most important to my health and well-being. That's why I practice all of them. They're very much interconnected. I hope I presented some ideas you may want to try out. I invite you to check out the Glass Half Full website for podcast episodes and YouTube videos. And I'm always learning new ways to take better care of myself, beat the odds of having a progressive neuromuscular disease, and I love to share these methods, these ways with others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to try to see if Lori's mic is working now. Just give me one moment here and we'll see if Lori, can you go ahead and talk?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go
You're
ahead.
on speakerphone. Should I hold up the handset? Would that be more helpful?
No,
Or is this okay?
we can hear you well. Go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me for this part of the panelists. Actually, the previous speaker has actually presented all the things that I was going to say. So I become sort of, repeating some of the great ideas that she had. So I'm going to go through quickly through my slides and then see if there's any questions. Definitely with regards to the previous speaker talking about making sure that, you are aware of your body and all that is really, really important. So my next slide. So a couple of things to remember. This is the money slide, as one of the speakers mentioned. Eat the rainbow. The previous speaker and I didn't communicate or didn't chat before, and so great minds do think alike. Definitely eat the rainbow. Variety is spice of life, and that's part of it. Having different variety, trying different things, it is very, very important. Now that we're sort of in our own space and maybe potentially can think about trying new things. When we're too busy, we're just, get into a rut potentially, but now we have more time, and then maybe some of the things we try is the rainbow, coloring it. Being mindful when eating, I think this is very, very important, and the previous speaker also talked about that. With regards to eating, we get so rushed and that we just want to fill our tummy, but really eating it's an experience. And have you ever gone to Japan? They really focus on eating beautiful food in small quantities. And there's a saying in Japan that you only eat up until 70% or 80% until you're full. That's fullness to them, because you want to enjoy that eating experience. So this is just a mindful eating exercise that you might want to try. Just sort of be in present, be in the moment, okay? And deep breathing. And then just when, especially if you close one of your senses, say, close your eyes and feel what's in your mouth. And I think that's really, really important. So, and a lot of the both speakers talk about, there's a lot of complex factors involved with sort of live healthily. It sounds so simple, but it's really, really complex. It's really, there's a lot of factors that, everybody has that we are not aware of. So genetic influences, sleep, previous speaker talked about that, and metabolism and medication that impact on it. And really, there's no miracle to weight management or watching your weight, but rather involve a lot of hard work, okay? And I've been fortunate to know Dr. McPherson and Dr. McAdam that's done a lot of research with support of Muscular Dystrophy of Canada. Next slide. So today we'll focus on, and the previous speaker really talked about that a lot, and she gave really wonderful tips that you should try and try one at a time, not to be overwhelmed. So today, a couple of my slides will talk about building a balanced meal, portion control using the plate method, and increased awareness of food, which I talked about, the mindful eating, mindfulness of eating. And being active, however that looks in your life, especially with current situation of physical distancing and limited ability of exercising. And so definitely Zoom, a lot of, I know Peloton or some of the other ones that have Zoom. I know I belong to the YMCA, and they've been sending out tips, and also some of the instructors are also able to provide limited sessions through Zoom. So if you're handy with that, obviously I'm not, because I'm having my difficulties, but that would be a good thing. And I don't say this very often, but screen time with exercising is a great thing. One of my friends, she was talking about her son who's a 5-year-old, he loves Sonic. I think Sonic is a hedgehog. That's a video game, and there's a lot of movement in that game. So, so she says she's, participating with him, sweating throughout the session of like 15, 20 minutes. So, next slide. So this is the guidance from Health Canada of the plate method. And Diabetes Canada also advocate this. And so it's very colorful. And if you look at it, half the plate is filled with vegetable and fruit. And definitely there's a rainbow right there that you can see. And also eating protein foods are very, very important. That's a quarter of your plate, and whole grains is another quarter. Next slide. So during these uncertain times or certain situations, it doesn't have to be now, but anytime, each individual reacts differently. But we're all under certain level of stress. And stress hormone that I listed here, right there, does have impact on how well we're going to be, how well or how our body reacts. And this is a very busy slide, but it does impact. Next slide. So eating well and healthily begins with providing both calming and the stress-fighting foods with antioxidant that can counter impact of stress and energize you by shoring up the immune system and maintaining steady blood sugar and lowering blood pressure. So next slide. So color the rainbow. And as Health Canada recommending eating veggies and fruits, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone, basically. You have fiber and also the antioxidants and all the vitamin minerals that you need to function in your body. And on top, they're low calories. So you can bulk up on them, they're the excellent source, and fill half your plate with it and eat the rainbow. Next slide. Fiber. It makes you full, but fiber in veggie and fruit, low calorie. But in grains and starches, you actually have to be aware of your portion size. And so definitely the soluble and insoluble fiber, they both play a part in making you full. So next slide. I was instructed to say, what can we do to sort of help shore up our immune system? Omega-3 fatty acids found in food are excellent to support heart health, improve brain and eye health, fight inflammation. That's what antioxidant does, okay? And so omega-3 fatty acid does help with that and improve sleep. The previous speaker was talking about improving sleep, okay? And so omega-3 is one of them. Next slide. And so what contains omega-3? Well, polyunsaturated fatty acid like canola oil, monounsaturated fat like olive oil, okay? And fish, when I counsel patients, I often tell them, fish really is brain food. It really helps with the development of brain cells and also help with, it helps with brain health and also eye health. So really, it's a great thing to have. They recommend, so some of the things that you want to avoid during this time when you're under stress. Try to limit your caffeinated beverage because they can cause anxiety and raise your stress hormone. Trans fatty acid. So the previous slide at the bottom of it, I have on there is the trans fat, the hydrogenated fatty acid that you want to, and saturated fat that you want to limit. that is found in cake, pies, and cookies. Not to say that you shouldn't have any, but you should limit them, and you should be careful in sort of the portion size. Next. Sugar. They really add a lot of pleasure in your diet, in your life. It does for me, but I have to be careful. I have to watch the amount that I do eat, not to over eat them, and definitely they do add additional stress in your body. Alcohol, same thing. Next slide. So planning meals should be or can be as easy as A, B, C, and D. Definitely start with a green leafy vegetable or any other color if you like. Add a poultry or fish as a side dish, making sure it's a quarter of the plate. And also try, like the previous speaker was talking about, try a meatless meal, lentils, beans, egg and tofu. They're great. Actually, egg and dairy has high B12 vitamins, which the first speaker was talking about that we often find in, the population that might be attending today. Then consider whole grains as quarter of the plate, okay? And lastly, round out with dessert as a fruit. Not always, but, okay, definitely majority of the time. So this is looking nicely, this stress-busting diet with a leafy spinach, a salad with a bit of crunchy nuts, because nuts is very calorically dense, so you don't want to eat too much of it, but they're very, very high omega-3, which is very, very good. Chunks of lean poultry or bright orange and red fruits, whole grain roll, a glass of milk or calcium-containing beverage that has calcium and vitamin D in it, which the first speaker was talking about in the population we see here might be deficient in. And, top off with berry fruit cup. Another thing to help you feel full, low-calorie beverages, water, very cleansing, and a low-sodium broth, that's excellent filler. A good friend of mine who's Italian, they start off with a broth soup as their beginning meal and end with a big salad. So that Italian has it, and with the small entree in between that. So next slide. And the previous speaker also talked about being physically active, release stress, strengthen the heart and lung muscles, increase energy level, help maintain and achieve healthy body weight, and improve your outlook on life, especially the yoga and the deep breathing. And definitely listen to your body. Slow down your eating. Enjoy your food. It really does take 20 minutes for your body to tell you that you're full. So take the time to savor your food, Body has a natural way of knowing how much to eat, usually, okay? And as I mentioned, Japanese has a saying that says that 70 to 80% is being full. And definitely space your meal 4 to 5 without eating, okay? Be specific. If you're gonna say, I'm gonna try an orange vegetable, like squash, or a fruit like cantaloupe, that is good enough. Having one specific goal, I'm gonna have that 3 times this week. That's realistic, there's a time frame, and it's measurable. Next slide. Definitely be realistic. Oh, sorry, go back to the previous slide. Be realistic, start with 1 or 2 goals. Have a friend or family member to stick together with your goal, all right? And there's no failure, okay? You're trying to improve your health. Every day is a gold star day, all right? And I just have a few links that you can click onto for more information.
Thank you very much. So being mindful of time, I do want to get to some questions. Thankfully, Dr. Tarnopolsky has typed in some questions as well, but we had some questions submitted today. So we'll go ahead with the first question. My son has Duchenne muscular dystrophy. What is the impact of his weight on obstructive sleep apnea? Dr. Tarnopolsky?
Yeah, so obstructive sleep apnea has been well studied because it's very common in the general population. And we know that obesity has a major impact. Probably just the adipose tissue around the neck will occlude. So the obstruction really is that when you're breathing, the neck structures tend to collapse and you hear this and sort of you obstruct your breathing. The problem with that is that if you already have weakness in the diaphragm from Duchenne dystrophy, and then you throw an obstruction on top of that, it can really lower your oxygen and increase the carbon dioxide, which can lead to headaches, poor sleep, even muscle pain if you have such bad sleep. So it's really important to do sleep studies. We would first start generally with an oxygen saturation, which can be arranged even during COVID-19 because you can bring the O2 sat to the home. A full sleep study is quite a bit more invasive. And with those, they actually hook you up to an EEG. They're measuring your oxygen and carbon dioxide when you sleep. So we would always start with a saturation study in someone with neuromuscular disease. But you usually know if someone has sleep apnea because if you listen to them, what you'll hear is a sudden pause. And the pause can be up to 10 or 15 seconds. And then it usually ends with a and almost like a strange snorting sound. And if you hear that, it's pretty likely that there's sleep apnea. So with muscular dystrophy, the problem with the standard treatment of sleep apnea is to use something called CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure. The problem there is that if you have weak diaphragm, you're pushing against that pressure coming in. So that's why a respirologist needs to be involved, because if there is diaphragm weakness, you would want BiPAP, which pushes the air in, but then the pressure drops to allow the air to come out. So it is quite a complicated issue. Of course, for many reasons, we think that control of weight is helpful. It's easier said than done. I've been following boys and men as a practicing physician for 25 years who have different types of dystrophy. And boy, it is extremely hard to lose weight once you've gained it. The other issue, which we're going to highlight in our paper with DEXA scans in boys and men with muscular dystrophy, is when you go on corticosteroids. For example, we've had boys with Duchenne, when they're 5 and 6, before they're on steroids, their body fat is around 12 to 14%. Put them on steroids, and we've got boys going up to 60% body fat within a year on corticosteroids. So although they do ultimately help with the breathing, help with the lungs, help with the heart, and keep you out of a wheelchair by 2.5 years in Duchenne, that obesity is a real bear. And also is going to start as we have our men now with Duchenne living into their 40s, we're going to increase the risk of obesity-associated disease like heart disease, high cholesterol, and all the things that go with obesity.
Excellent, thank you. The next question here is, are there supplements that patients with muscular dystrophy should absolutely stay away from?
Well, I think the problem is stay away from anything that's not been well studied and proven. So what is proven? Good nutrition is proven throughout the years. There's no question that the excellent practical tips that the two previous speakers have given are absolutely outstanding, and I think really will promote the optimization of protein, a good quality of antioxidants and stuff. What has been shown? Well, I think vitamin D deficiency, that's so prevalent, that needs to be identified and treated. In general, we recommend a balanced multivitamin, giving people essentially the Canadian and US daily recommendation after our study showed that so many people were not even meeting current Canadian guidelines. And once we started checking, we found that a lot of people are low. I think that's low-hanging fruit, inexpensive, and you're not going to cause toxicity. I think the guidelines for creatine are pretty strong for those with muscular dystrophy. And we now know from 30 plus years experience, and the extensive research in bodybuilders that it's very, very safe. We do know for sure, even big, huge bodybuilders, that 5% of people will get an upset tummy on creatine. So we always start with divided doses, meaning you take it with breakfast and supper, take it right in the middle of your meal. And even still, some people will still get tummy upset, and that's about 5 to upwards of 10% of people. So you might have to not, or cut back, or just not take it if that is the issue. Beyond that, there really are very few supplements that have been well studied enough to risk a potential side effect or to be spending money on. But I'd be happy to talk to any specifics if people have ones that they want to ask me about.
Great. Is there any research to back up the use of coenzyme Q10? This individual has limb-girdle muscular dystrophy.
Sure. So coenzyme Q10 is an essential factor in the mitochondria. It essentially helps in the energy shuttle between these little electrons that ultimately make energy. CoQ10 can either gain an electron and become reduced, or lose an electron and become oxidized. So in certain states, it can become an antioxidant. So if you have evidence for increased oxidative stress in a specific muscular dystrophy, which we and others have shown for Duchenne, for myotonic dystrophy type 1, and it's been shown for both mitochondrial myopathy as well as FSH muscular dystrophy type 1, there may be benefits to antioxidants. The challenge is that any antioxidant taken on its own can become a pro-oxidant and work in the opposite way. So in general, we like to provide balanced antioxidants. So if you're taking a antioxidant in one of the disorders that I talked about, where there is some evidence that it impairs the muscle function, we like balanced antioxidants, which kind of gets back to the whole concept of food, because Mother Nature had so many antioxidants in food. It's not just vitamin E or vitamin C. And we do know that taking only one antioxidant like vitamin E or vitamin C or CoQ10 on its own, it can become a pro-oxidant, which I think is probably why these have generally failed in clinical trials when you only use one. Now, we've published a paper, and I alluded to it in some of my comments that I was writing back to people, in mitochondrial myopathy, where we combined coenzyme Q10 with alpha-lipoic acid and vitamin E and creatine. And in a human, in patients with mitochondrial disease, we showed a lowering of oxidative stress. So we proved that it was not functioning in the reverse direction. When we only gave coenzyme Q10, we saw no benefits, and we saw no reduction in oxidative stress. So yes, CoQ10 makes sense in the right context, but generally in combination with other antioxidants. And our paper in 2007, Rodriguez and Tarnopolsky talks about that and shows the benefits.
Excellent. So this individual has CMT and is on the call. They've been looking into high dose vitamin C by IV. Does this work? Could this also help to boost their immune system given the COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone and their dog thinks that vitamin C is going to improve your immune system. And there's companies that have made billions of dollars promoting this, Energy C and all these other things out there, and Emergency, et cetera, et cetera. Linus Pauling got a Nobel Prize many, many years ago and promoted it big time. But the evidence is pretty scant. And as I was mentioning, for antioxidants, if you take too much of one, it can become a pro-oxidant and go in the opposite direction. The problem with vitamin C, it can also cause crystallization in the kidneys and give you kidney stones, which patients with mitochondrial disease, muscular dystrophy, and anyone who's relatively immobile are more prone to begin with. So you got to be careful with that. The vitamin C question came about with CMT1A, which is a very specific PMP22 duplication. My understanding is, and again, I'm more of a muscle genetic and neurogenetic specialist, so I don't know the latest, but my understanding was that the studies really didn't show that it was of much benefit. So I would be pretty reluctant to take high doses of vitamin C. I don't see any problem taking 500 milligrams in the flu season. There's some weak evidence that it can lower the duration of cold-like symptoms, but to think that it's going to prevent or speed up the recovery from COVID-19, I think is definitely fanciful at this point. Good hand hygiene and just being careful wearing masks appropriately when you go out, I think, is the most appropriate thing to avoid COVID-19.
Great. And I know I'm mindful of time, but I just want to get to one more question. My daughter has SMA and has trouble with feeding. She tends to choke on her food. We are struggling between avoiding choking and the risk of breathing in foods and ensuring she gets enough nutrition. Any tips? Dr.
Yeah.
Tarnopolsky,
This is a real challenge because the alpha motor neurons, which go to our throat to help with swallowing, can be affected in this disorder. And so not just the arms and legs, but the swallowing is quite often required. So our kids with type 1 and type 2 often develop swallowing problems and usually need to have a feeding tube. Usually the most effective and best thing to start with is a proper swallowing study to make sure that there's no aspiration. And the speech language pathologist will give advice as to the consistency of food and various strategies. Sometimes, for example, with SMA, the neck twists a little bit and a little pressure on one side of the neck can dramatically improve swallowing. But those sort of strategies are best done with a skilled speech language pathologist who's familiar with this disorder. Now, a lot of parents and even older adults who get to the point with SMA where they need or they're contemplating a feeding tube, avoid it and avoid it. But generally, when people do have a feeding tube, there is almost a relief, and people tell me, wow, I should have done it sooner. And the misconception is that if you have a feeding tube, you can't take anything orally. And that's not the case. What you're doing is putting a lot of the nutrition through the feeding tube to maintain vitamins, minerals, protein, and all of those things. And then what I call the fun food, you can still take small amounts, but minimizing the risk of choking and aspirating, which can be quite a serious issue. And certainly if there's choking, make sure that you're skilled in Heimlich maneuver, but really get a speech language pathologist involved who knows a lot about this disorder.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for being patient as we manage through our technical difficulties. And I would like to thank our speakers for sharing their insights into the mission team at Muscular Dystrophy Canada for their ongoing work with supporting individuals in our neuromuscular community. I will post top 5 key learnings from this webinar. I also understand there are questions that were not addressed. I think the best approach will be please email research@muscle.ca and we can forward a collection of those questions to Dr. Tarnopolsky to avoid him getting a number of emails, especially during this busy time. So that's research@muscle.ca, and thank you once again for joining today's webinar. Have a good day.
Thanks for organizing.